Who holds the earnest money? The short answer is B. It's negotiable, like most things in real estate. A is incorrect because there's no law specifying who holds the earnest money. D is incorrect because the broker holds it, not the agent. A little tricky there. C could be correct. The listing broker can hold it, but it's not a requirement. But first, what is earnest money? It's basically a deposit by the buyer. If everything goes according to plan, it gets credited to you at closing as part of your down payment. If for some reason you default on the contract, the seller gets it to compensate them for the time you caused their home to be off the market. Here's the most common scenario. You negotiate 1% as the earnest money and send that to my broker through an online ACH transfer within 3 days of the binding agreement. It gets credited to you at closing. But most of the details are negotiable. First, just know that the earnest money is held in a special escrow account. Mishandling earnest money will get a broker into big trouble, so it's something they do with extreme care and diligence. Sometimes listing agents insist on their broker holding their earnest money. Sometimes they want the closing attorney to hold it. When representing a buyer, I always want my broker to hold it. But I wouldn't make it a deal breaker. If there's a dispute as to who gets the earnest money, even though the holder of the earnest money technically has the right to decide, most of the time they'll send it to arbitration because brokers don't want to be caught up in the middle. So that's why it really doesn't matter too much as to who holds the earnest money. In normal markets, a typical earnest money is about 1% of the purchase price. So the expected amount for a $500,000 home would be at least $5,000. You could offer less, say $1,000, but that makes you look like you aren't serious or maybe you aren't that financially capable. To get the best deal, you always want to be perceived as serious and financially capable. If you want to make a really good impression, you might consider up to 2% for the earnest money, but I really don't recommend that. Sometimes high amounts will stir up the litigious nature of someone when disputes arise. Few will go after $5,000, especially knowing that the loser pays all the legal fees. But they might feel differently if the potential payday is $50,000. It becomes a big fat target. You used to have the earnest money in hand at the time of submitting the contract. Now there's a spot on the contract for a negotiated time frame. I usually recommend 2 to 3 days after the binding agreement date. You have to specify a method of payment. The easiest is for an online ACH transfer. You can also do a bank wire, but many times banks charge a fee for that. You can do a check, but just remember checks will be cashed, so make sure the money is there. You could do cash, but please don't. We don't have a safe at the office for that. Even if we don't make it to the closing table, the buyer can still get their earnest money back under one of the contingencies that might have been negotiated into the contract, such as the due diligence contingency. If during the due diligence period, the buyer decides to terminate for any reason or no reason, he gets the earnest money back, no questions asked. If the buyer gets denied for a loan before the end of the finance contingency, they get their earnest money back. Under the standard appraisal contingency, if the appraisal comes in low and the seller doesn't agree to the lower price, the buyer has the option to terminate and get their earnest money back. There's a detailed process spelled out in the contract for how the disbursement of earnest money is handled. It's on page 3, item number 6 and 7, more than half a page. My broker always says, when in doubt, read the contract. That's all that matters. The buyer's agent sends a special notice to the seller. The seller signs off on it and sends it back to me. I show the signed off form to my broker. My broker either writes you a check or wires it back to you. If there's any dispute or if the seller refuses to sign the release agreement, we just follow the process spelled out in the contract. Sellers can get funny if they think the buyer wasn't acting in good faith. They'll take as long as possible to respond. Therefore, the earnest money could be in limbo for a few weeks because a series of notices have to be sent out, even if it's a clear case who gets the earnest money. So that could be a problem if you wanted to use that earnest money as earnest money for another home. That's why it's best to keep earnest money as small as possible and to always keep good relations with everyone involved in the transaction.